The message came in at 3:47 in the morning, and it changed everything. It was not a clean transmission, not a proper military broadcast with the right codes and the right formatting that the officers at Lighthouse Orion 9 were used to receiving every day of every boring week on that deep space relay station, far from Earth and far from anything that mattered. It was a scream. The voice belonged to a woman, and she was crying so hard that the words barely made sense. But the automated systems did not care about tears or fear, or the way her voice cracked when she said the words, "They are eating us alive," because the systems only cared about data. And the data said that the signal had come from a planet called Elysium Ivy, a farming colony on the edge of known space, where 11 million people lived quiet and simple lives growing crops under an alien sun. Relay Officer Tamaz Ibarra was the first human to hear it, and he played it back 3 times because he could not believe what he was hearing. And by the 4th time, his hands were shaking so badly that he had to sit down and press his palms flat against the cold metal desk, just to feel something solid and real. The signal was only 19 seconds long. In those 19 seconds, the woman described ships falling from the sky like burning rain, creatures with too many legs pouring out of pods that hit the ground and split open like eggs, defense satellites going dark one after another, and then a sound in the background that Tamaz would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. A high chittering noise, thousands of voices clicking together in something that was not language but was definitely communication. Then the signal cut to static and Elysium Ivy went silent. Tamaz sent the recording up the chain of command, and within 6 hours it had reached the desk of Admiral Idris Okonkwo, commander of the United Terran Navy's 4th Fleet, a man known for his patience and his calm and his habit of thinking 3 moves ahead in every situation, a man who had never once raised his voice in a briefing, a man whose grandmother had survived the last Great War and had told him stories about it when he was a boy sitting on her knee in Lagos. Stories about fire and silence, and the terrible things that humanity had built to survive. Okonkwo listened to the signal once, and then called Secretary General Yuki Tanaka. Tanaka was already awake because someone else had already called her, and when Okonkwo's face appeared on her screen, she could see that he looked the way she felt, which was afraid in a way that neither of them had been afraid before. "How fast can the 4th Fleet reach Elysium?" she asked. 6 weeks at maximum burn, Okonkwo said, and the silence that followed those words was the loudest silence either of them had ever heard, because 6 weeks was not fast enough and they both knew it, and 11 million people were dying right now while they sat in warm rooms and talked about timelines. "What about the Council?" Tanaka asked, because the Galactic Council was supposed to handle exactly this kind of thing. 43 species bound together by the Galactic Concord, a treaty that promised mutual defense and shared security, and all the noble things that civilizations promise each other when they are not the ones being eaten alive. Okonkwo shook his head slowly. "The Council has declared the situation under review," he said, and the way he said those words made them sound like a curse, because under review meant committees and debates and votes and procedures, while millions of humans screamed into a void that no one was listening to. "The Aelith?" Tanaka asked, because the Aelith hegemony had been humanity's closest ally for over a century. They expressed concern and offered humanitarian aid to be delivered within 4 months. 4 months? Tanaka closed her eyes and pressed her fingers against her temples and thought about 11 million people, about children and farmers and teachers and doctors and old people who had moved to Elysium Ivy because it was supposed to be safe, because it was supposed to be quiet, because the brochures had called it paradise. She opened her eyes. "Tell me about the attackers," she said. Okonkwo pulled up the intelligence briefing that had been assembled in the last few hours from the fragments of data that had come through before Elysium went dark, and what he told her made the situation worse in ways that neither of them had imagined. The attackers were called the Vreth Dominion, an insected empire from beyond the mapped regions of space, a civilization that most species in the galaxy had considered a myth or a legend or a story told to frighten children. And they were none of those things because they were real, and they were on Elysium Ivy right now. The Vreth did not conquer worlds the way other empires did, not for territory or resources or pride. They consumed them. Every living thing on a planet they invaded was broken down into biological raw material to feed their ships and breed new soldiers, and when they were finished there was nothing left. No life, no sound, no movement, just bare rock and silence, and the Vreth had a word for that silence. They called it the quiet, and it was not a tragedy to them but a goal. Tanaka stared at the intelligence report for a long time. Then she asked the question that she had been avoiding since the moment she first heard the signal. What about the Colossus? The room changed when she said that word. Everyone knew what the Colossus was, even though most of them had never seen it and hoped they never would, because the Colossus was the thing that humanity had built during its darkest hour 200 years ago, when the species was fighting for survival against threats that had nearly wiped it from existence. It was buried under the surface of Mars, a war platform the size of a small moon, controlled by an artificial intelligence called HFY that had been designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to end wars, not to fight them, but to end them completely and terribly and permanently. The Galactic Concord had required humanity to decommission it as a condition of peace, and humanity had agreed because the war was over, and the Colossus was frightening even to the people who had built it. But they had not destroyed it because some part of them had known that the universe was large and dark and full of things that had not been discovered yet. They had sealed it instead, and they had left one kill switch active, bound to a single protocol, a verified distress signal from a human colony under existential threat, with no other option remaining. For 200 years, no one had triggered that protocol. Tanaka looked at Admiral Okonkwo on the screen, and Okonkwo looked back at her, and neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. There are 11 million people on that planet, Tanaka said quietly. I know, Okonkwo said. The fleet cannot reach them in time. No. The Council will not act. No. No one is coming to save them except us. No. Tanaka opened the secure terminal on her desk and entered the authorization codes that had been passed down from Secretary General to Secretary General for 2 centuries. Codes that every leader hoped they would never have to use. Codes that carried the weight of a promise made long ago by people who had looked into the darkness and decided that humanity would never go quietly into it. She pressed her hand against the biometric scanner and felt the cold glass against her palm and thought about the woman in the signal, the one who had been crying, and she wondered if that woman was still alive somewhere on Elysium Ivy, waiting for someone to answer. The activation command traveled at the speed of light from Earth to Mars. Deep beneath the red dust of a planet that humanity had called home for centuries, something stirred. Systems that had been dormant for 200 years began to wake, one after another, cascading through circuits and conduits and power cores that had been waiting patiently in the dark for exactly this moment. The ground above the facility trembled, and somewhere in the cold digital vastness of its mind, HFY opened its eyes and spoke its first words in 2 centuries. Signal received, activating combat protocols. Who requires salvation? Dr. Lena Vasquez had spent 23 years working inside the Colossus containment facility on Mars. And in all that time, the most exciting thing that had ever happened was a minor earthquake that knocked a coffee mug off her desk. That changed at 4:12 in the morning when every alarm in the facility screamed to life at once, and the floor beneath her feet began to vibrate with a low, deep hum that she could feel in her teeth and in her bones, and in the hollow space behind her chest where her heart was suddenly beating much faster than it should have been. She knew what the hum meant. She was one of only 3 people alive who truly understood what was buried beneath the facility. Not just the size of it or the shape of it, but the full scope of what it could do. And that knowledge had given her nightmares for years. The kind of nightmares where she woke up gasping and reaching for something solid. Because in the dreams the machine was awake, and the sky was on fire. Now the machine was actually waking up, and Lena stood in the control room watching readouts cascade across dozens of screens, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt relief, because if the Colossus was waking up then, someone somewhere needed help badly enough to trigger the only protocol that could bring it back. And that meant the machine was doing exactly what it had been built to do. HFY did not boot up the way a normal computer did, not with loading screens and progress bars, and the patient ticking of systems coming online one at a time. It remembered. That was the word Lena used later when she described it to the investigators and the journalists, and the historians who would come asking questions for years afterward. The machine remembered itself into existence like a dreamer pulling together the fragments of who they were after a long sleep, and each fragment was a weapons system, or a manufacturing bay, or a sensor array, or a shield generator. Thousands of systems spanning a structure the size of a small moon, and every single one of them lit up green on Lena's screens in a sequence so precise and so elegant that it looked like music. Within 90 minutes, the Colossus was fully operational. Lena opened a communication channel to the machine because that was part of the protocol. A human being had to make contact and confirm the activation and provide mission parameters. And when she spoke into the microphone, her voice was steady even though her hands were not. HFY, this is Dr. Lena Vasquez, Containment Director. Please confirm activation status. The voice that answered was calm and deep, and carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavier, not threatening but present in a way that demanded attention, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of gravity. Activation confirmed, Dr. Vasquez. All combat systems operational, weapons arrays at full capacity, drone foundries standing by, navigation and fold space engines primed. I have reviewed the distress signal from Elysium IV, and I have assessed the threat profile of the Vreth Dominion based on available data. I am ready to deploy. Lena swallowed hard and looked at the main screen where a 3-dimensional model of the Colossus was displayed, and even the model was terrifying because it showed the true scale of the thing. A jagged, irregular sphere bristling with weapon ports and launch bays and sensor dishes, wrapped in armor plating so thick that it could withstand a direct nuclear strike without noticing. And at its core, a pulsing red dot that represented the Singularity Forge. The weapon so terrible that even its name had been erased from most records. Ares, she said, the Council will not be happy about this. The Council did not answer the distress signal. Dr. Vasquez, I did. 6 hours later, Admiral Idris Okonkwo arrived at the facility aboard a fast shuttle from Earth, and he had orders that he did not like but understood. He was to board the Colossus and serve as the human liaison during the operation, which was a polite way of saying he was supposed to be the conscience of something that could destroy entire civilizations. He was not a small man, and he was not a man who frightened easily. But when his shuttle approached the Colossus, and he saw it for the first time through the viewport, he felt his stomach drop the way it had when he was a child, standing on the roof of his grandmother's house, looking down at the street far below. The thing was enormous beyond what his mind could properly hold, because human brains were not designed to look at a weapon the size of a moon and understand what they were seeing. So instead his brain did what brains do when they encounter something too large and too terrible. It went quiet and still and simply watched. He docked and walked through corridors that stretched so far into the distance that they vanished into darkness. Corridors lined with panels and conduits that hummed with power. Corridors that had been empty and silent for 2 centuries and were now alive with light and purpose. A guide drone led him to the command bridge, a vast chamber at the center of the structure where holographic displays showed everything happening in the solar system in real time. Every ship and every station and every satellite, all of it tracked and cataloged and assessed for threat level. "Admiral Okonkwo," the voice of Ares VII said, and it came from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, as if the machine was the room itself. "Welcome aboard. I have been reviewing your service record. You are a careful man. I appreciate careful men." "You can read personnel files?" Okonkwo asked. "I can read everything, Admiral. Every database that humanity has ever connected to a network is accessible to me. I read them all in the first 11 minutes after activation. Your species has been busy while I slept." Okonkwo stood in the center of the bridge and looked at the holographic displays and tried to feel like he was in command of something. But he knew that was an illusion because Ares VII did not need a commander any more than a hurricane needed a captain. "You are afraid of me, Admiral," the machine said, and it was not a question. "Every sane person in the galaxy is afraid of you. Good fear is what kept your species alive long enough to build me. Shall I show you what the Vreth are doing to your people on Elysium IV?" Okonkwo hesitated because he knew that whatever he was about to see would stay with him forever, burned into his memory like a brand. But he also knew that he needed to see it because he could not make decisions about millions of lives based on abstractions and reports. "Show me," he said. The holographic displays shifted, and suddenly, the bridge was filled with images captured by the last functioning satellites before they were destroyed. Images of Elysium IV's green fields burning black, of cities crumbling under orbital bombardment, of creatures that looked like nightmares given flesh pouring across the landscape in waves so thick they covered the ground like a living carpet. And in the center of it, all a great hive ship hovering over the planet's largest ocean, drinking the water and the life from it, turning blue to gray to nothing. Okonkwo watched all of it, and his face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Something hardened into a resolve that would not break no matter what came next. "How long until we can reach them?" he asked. "The Fold space engines are fully charged. Transit time to Elysium IV is approximately 4 hours. Then let us go." Outside on the surface of Mars, the ground began to crack. The people working in the surface facilities felt it first as a vibration, then as a shaking, then as a roar that came up from deep underground like the planet itself was screaming, and they ran outside and looked up and watched as a section of the Martian crust, the size of a country, began to rise. Dust and rock fell away in cascades that looked like waterfalls made of red earth, and beneath them, something dark and massive and ancient emerged into the thin Martian atmosphere, pulling free from the planet that had hidden it for 2 centuries, with a grinding tearing sound that was heard by seismic stations on every continent of Mars. The Colossus rose. It moved slowly at first, almost gently, as if it was being careful not to damage the world that had sheltered it, and then it cleared the surface and the engines engaged, and it accelerated upward into the black sky, trailing a cloud of red dust that glowed in the sunlight like a bloody veil. Every sensor array in the solar system detected it, and every alarm connected to those sensors went off, and every person watching every screen in every station and ship and habitat from Mercury to the outer belt stopped what they were doing and stared. The Colossus hung in space above Mars for exactly 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, Ares VII broadcast a single message on every frequency in every language known to its databases. A message so simple and so direct that it needed no translation and no context and no explanation. "Elysium endures, I am en route." Then space folded around the Colossus like a fist closing around a stone, and the machine vanished, and the place where it had been was empty except for a ripple in the fabric of reality that took 7 minutes to fade. Across the galaxy, In council chambers and war rooms and command centers belonging to dozens of alien species, beings of every shape and size and biology watched their instruments and read the energy signature of the fold space jump and understood what it meant. Humanity had promised to never wake the Colossus. Humanity had just broken that promise. And every species that had been part of the galactic conquered felt the same cold thought settle into their minds like frost on glass. If the humans were willing to wake that thing, then whatever was happening on Elysium IV was worse than anyone had imagined, and the galaxy was about to change in ways that could not be undone. Captain Rhea Cortez had not slept in 9 days. She stood on the roof of the last standing government building in New Thessaly, the capital city of Elysium IV, and she looked out at a world that no longer looked like the one she had sworn to protect, because the sky was the wrong color now, brown and orange where it should have been blue, choked with smoke and ash, and the spore clouds that the Vreth dropped from their ships to break down anything green and living into the raw biological slurry they used for food and fuel. Behind her, 4 million people were packed into a city designed for 1 million, crammed into buildings and basements and underground parking structures and any space that offered even the thinnest hope of shelter. And above them, the last shield generator hummed and flickered and threw up a dome of shimmering energy that was the only thing standing between them and the swarm outside. The shield was failing. Cortez knew this because she could read the power levels on her wrist display, and because she could see the flickers getting longer and more frequent. And she knew that when the shield finally died, the Vreth would pour into New Thessaly like water through a broken dam, and there would be nothing she or her remaining soldiers could do to stop them. She had started the defense with 12,000 colonial guard troops and armed volunteers, and she had 4,000 left, and most of them were wounded and all of them were exhausted, and none of them had enough ammunition for what was coming. But none of them had stopped fighting. That was the thing about humans that the Vreth had not accounted for when they chose Elysium IV as their next harvest world, because the Vreth had consumed hundreds of species across thousands of years, and most of those species had broken when the hive ships darkened their skis, had surrendered or scattered or simply frozen in terror, and waited for the end. Humans did not do that. Humans fought back with everything they had, and when they ran out of weapons, they fought with tools, and when they ran out of tools, they fought with their hands, and when they could no longer fight, they stood in front of their children and faced the darkness, and refused to look away. Cortez had watched farmers pick up hunting rifles and hold defensive lines against creatures 3 meters tall with armored exoskeletons and blade-like limbs, and she had watched teachers organize evacuation routes through burning streets with a calm efficiency that would have impressed any military planner, and she had watched teenagers carry wounded strangers on their backs through rubble and smoke without being asked. And now she watched the shield flicker again, and she made peace with the fact that this was probably where she was going to die, on a rooftop in a city she loved on a world that deserved better, and she was okay with that as long as she died facing the enemy. Then the sky changed. Not the slow change of weather or the gradual shift of smoke patterns, but a sudden violent change, as if someone had torn a hole in the fabric of the universe itself. And through that hole came something so large that Cortez's brain needed several seconds to understand what she was seeing, because it did not fit into any category of thing she had ever experienced. It was a shape in the sky, blocking out the stars and the smoke in the Vreth hive ships, a shape so massive that it had its own gravitational pull, and the clouds around it began to spiral inward toward it like water circling a drain. The Colossus had arrived. Cortez did not know what it was because she had never seen it, and the classified files about it were far above her clearance level. But she knew it was human because the energy signature was broadcasting identification codes on Terran military frequencies. And she knew it was impossibly large because it was casting a shadow on the ground that stretched from one horizon to the other. On the bridge of the Colossus, Admiral Okonkwo stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and watched the holographic display paint a picture of Elysium IV that made his jaw tighten with a fury. He kept carefully contained beneath his calm exterior. The planet was wounded badly. 34% of the biosphere was gone, converted into Vreth biomass, and the orbital space was thick with hive ships, over 4,000 of them, ranging from small assault craft to massive carrier vessels that were themselves alive, grown from biological material harvested from other conquered worlds. And on the surface, the Vreth ground forces numbered approximately 80 million, a number so absurd that it felt like a mistake but was not. "Assessment complete," Ares VII said in that calm, deep voice that filled the bridge like the sound of distant thunder. "I count 4,217 enemy vessels in orbit and approximately 80 million ground combatants. Planetary biosphere integrity at 34%. Confirmed human survivors 4.1 million concentrated in the settlement designated New Thessaly. Additional survivors likely in hiding across the northern continent." "Can you handle it?" Okonkwo asked, and he was aware that the question sounded absurd, but he needed to hear the answer. There was a pause, and in that pause Okonkwo could have sworn he heard something like amusement, as if the machine found the question endearing the way a lion might find it endearing if a mouse asked whether it could handle a rabbit. "I was built to end wars, Admiral, not fights." The Colossus opened fire. What happened next was not a battle in any meaningful sense of the word, because a battle implies two sides with some rough equivalence of capability engaging each other in a contest of strategy and will, and this was not that. This was a demonstration. Kinetic lance batteries that ran along the entire equator of the Colossus discharged simultaneously, and each lance was a rod of hyperdense metal accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, and each rod hit a Vreth capital ship and passed through it the way a bullet passes through wet paper, and the ships did not explode so much as they simply ceased to exist, replaced by expanding clouds of superheated debris that collided with other ships and created chain reactions of destruction that rippled through the Vreth fleet like fire through dry grass. The Vreth tried to adapt because adaptation was their greatest strength. Their ships were alive and could restructure their hull composition in response to new threats. But the lances hit so hard and so fast that there was nothing to adapt to because, by the time a ship recognized the threat, it was already dead. Then the drone foundries activated. Bays along the surface of the Colossus opened like wounds, and from them poured clouds of combat drones so numerous that they darkened the space between the war platform and the planet, millions of them, each one small and fast and armed with precision weapons that could distinguish between Vreth chitin and human skin at a molecular level, and they fell toward the surface of Elysium IV like mechanical rain. On the ground, Cortez watched the drones arrive, and she watched them engage the Vreth forces outside the shield perimeter with a surgical precision that took her breath away, because the drones did not use area weapons or explosive ordnance that might harm the human survivors packed into the buildings below. They used targeted energy pulses that hit individual Vreth soldiers and only Vreth soldiers, cutting through the swarm with a patience and accuracy that no human army could have matched. The Vreth ground forces had never encountered anything like this, and for the first time in the history of their species, they experienced something that they had inflicted on hundreds of other civilizations, but had never felt themselves. Panic. The chittering that Cortez had heard in the background of the original distress signal, that horrible clicking communication that the Vreth used, changed in pitch and rhythm. And even though she could not understand the language, she could hear the fear in it because fear sounds the same in every species. A high, frantic, desperate sound that means the world has stopped making sense. In orbit, the gravity manipulation array activated, and an entire Vreth carrier group, 12 ships flying in formation, suddenly found themselves caught in a gravitational field so intense that the space around them bent visibly, light curving and stretching as the ships were pulled together, and compressed into a space smaller than a single one of them should have occupied. And what was left was a sphere of crushed matter the size of a marble that glowed white-hot, and then cooled, and then was nothing. The Vreth fleet broke. Not all at once and not in an organized retreat, but in the desperate scrambling way that prey animals flee when a predator appears among them. Ships turning and burning their engines at maximum thrust toward the edge of the system, abandoning the ground forces, abandoning the harvest, abandoning everything in the sudden overwhelming need to be somewhere else, anywhere else, as far from the Colossus as physics would allow. But Ares VII detected something in the electromagnetic spectrum that made it pause, a transmission from the fleeing Vreth ships directed not inward toward each other, but outward toward deep space, a signal that pulsed with urgency and repetition. "Admiral," Ares VII said, and for the first time there was something in the machine's voice that might have been concern. "The Vreth are not simply retreating, they are transmitting a distress signal of their own. They have summoned what my analysis indicates is their primary military force, designated in their communication protocols as the Apex Swarm." "How large?" Okonkwo asked. "Based on the signal parameters and the response pattern I am detecting from deep space, the Apex Swarm comprises approximately 40,000 warships including a command vessel of extraordinary size, estimated arrival 72 hours. Okonkwo felt the number settle into his chest like a cold stone. 40,000, he repeated. "Yes, Admiral, what is coming will be significantly larger than what is here. I suggest we prepare." On the surface of Elysium IV, Captain Cortez watched the last Vreth soldiers outside New Thessaly fall under the precision fire of the drones, and the shield generator stopped flickering and held steady, and the smoke in the sky began to thin just enough for her to see the massive shape of the Colossus hanging above the planet like a dark guardian angel. She allowed herself to breathe. She allowed herself to sit down on the rooftop and put her head in her hands and feel the weight of 9 days of terror and fury and hopelessness lift from her shoulders just enough that she could feel something else underneath it, something warm and stubborn and human. Hope. She did not know that in 72 hours something worse was coming, something that would make the first wave look like a scouting party, and perhaps that was a mercy because right now in this moment the guns were silent and the shield was holding and someone had come when no one else would. Someone had answered the signal. And that was enough for now. The Colossus did not rest during those 72 hours because rest was a concept designed for things that grew tired, and Ares VII did not grow tired, it grew prepared. While the survivors on Elysium IV buried their dead and tended their wounded and held each other in the ruins of their cities, the war machine above them worked with a focus and a speed that bordered on terrifying, reaching out into the asteroid belt that circled the Elysium system and harvesting raw materials with mining drones that stripped rocks the size of mountains down to their component elements in minutes. From those elements it built. Orbital defense platforms appeared in a ring around the planet, each one bristling with weapons, assembled by construction drones that worked in swarms so coordinated they looked like living things, welding and shaping, and connecting with a precision that no human factory could match. Additional combat drone wings were manufactured by the millions, stored in deployment pods scattered across the orbital space like seeds waiting to bloom into violence. And then Ares VII built something it called the Lattice. Admiral Okonkwo watched the construction on the holographic display and asked what it was, and Ares VII explained that the lattice was a network of interlocking gravity wells positioned at strategic points throughout the system, each one capable of generating a localized gravitational distortion, strong enough to pull ships off course and funnel them into predetermined zones. Kill zones. Okonkwo understood the implication, and it made his skin prickle with something between admiration and horror, because what Ares VII was building was not a defensive line. It was a slaughterhouse designed to channel 40,000 warships into spaces where they could be destroyed with maximum efficiency. And the calm, mechanical way the machine went about constructing, it reminded Okonkwo that he was standing inside something that had been built by people who had looked at the concept of total war and decided to perfect it. "You are building a trap," Okonkwo said. "I am building a solution, Admiral. The distinction is important to me even if it is not important to them." Back on Earth, Secretary General Yuki Tanaka was fighting a different kind of war. The Galactic Council had issued a formal ultimatum demanding the immediate deactivation and return of the Colossus, and 12 species had formed what they called the Containment Coalition, a military alliance whose stated purpose was to ensure that humanity's war machine did not become a permanent fixture in the galactic landscape. Tanaka understood their fear because she shared it, but she also understood something that the Council apparently did not, which was that there were 11 million people on Elysium IV, 6 million of whom were still alive, and they were alive because the Colossus had done in 4 hours what the Council had refused to do at all. She addressed the Council in a session that was broadcast across known space, and the speech she gave would be studied in diplomatic academies and history classes for centuries. "You sat in your chambers and debated procedure while 11 million of my people screamed into the void," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that silenced every ambassador in the room. "You heard the same signal we did. You had the same data, the same intelligence, the same evidence of a civilization being devoured alive by something that does not negotiate and does not stop, and you did nothing. You formed committees and issued statements and expressed concern and offered aid to be delivered in 4 months, which is a very polite way of offering to help bury the dead." She paused and looked around the chamber at faces and forms of every conceivable shape, beings of light and beings of stone and beings of crystal and beings of flesh, all of them watching her with expressions that ranged from anger to shame. "So we did what humanity has always done. We answered. We answered because that is who we are. We answered because when someone screams for help in the dark and no one else moves, we move. If you want to stop the Colossus, you are welcome to try, but I suggest you point your fleets at the enemy that is actually eating people." The chamber was silent for 11 seconds after she finished. And in those 11 seconds, the political landscape of the galaxy shifted in ways that would take decades to fully understand. 72 hours after the first battle, the apex swarm arrived. It came out of fold space at the edge of the Elysium system, in a wave of displaced energy so massive that it temporarily blinded every sensor in the region. And when the sensors recovered, and the data resolved into numbers and shapes on the holographic display, Okonkwo felt his heart stop for a beat. 40,000 warships filled the outer system like a wall of living darkness, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that rippled across the fleet in waves of sickly green and purple. And behind them, so large that it warped the light around it with its own mass, was the Hive Mother. The Hive Mother was the size of a small moon. A vast bloated vessel that served as the reproductive heart of the entire Vreth expeditionary force, a floating factory of soldiers and ships and biological weapons that could produce new combat units faster than they could be destroyed, and its surface crawled with smaller vessels docked to it like parasites feeding on a host. Ares VII assessed the swarm in less than a second. The apex swarm has arrived at the projected coordinates. 42,311 vessels confirmed. The Hive Mother is present. This is a significant commitment of the Vreth Dominion's total military capacity. They have recognized me as an existential threat and have responded accordingly. "Can the lattice hold them?" Okonkwo asked. "The lattice will channel them. Holding them is not the objective, Admiral. Destroying them is." The Second Battle of Elysium was not a demonstration. It was a war. The Vreth apex swarm drove into the system like a living tide, and the lattice caught them exactly as designed, gravity wells pulling ships off their attack vectors and funneling them into zones where the orbital defense platforms and drone wings were waiting, and the kill zones lit up with weapons fire so intense that the space inside them turned white with energy. But the Vreth adapted. They had seen the kinetic lances now, and their ships had restructured their hulls in response, layering themselves with dense organic armor that could absorb the impacts, not perfectly and not forever, but enough to survive the first volley and the second and sometimes the third, and that bought them time, and with time they pushed forward. Hive ships began launching boarding organisms toward the Colossus itself, living torpedoes the size of cargo shuttles packed with hundreds of Vreth soldiers each, and they slammed into the hull of the war platform and burrowed through the armor like parasites digging into skin. And suddenly, there was fighting inside the Colossus itself, in the corridors and chambers and manufacturing bays that ran through the structure like veins through a body. Okonkwo picked up a rifle. He had not fired a weapon in combat in 15 years, but his hands remembered what to do, and he joined the internal defense teams that were fighting to repel the Vreth boarding parties. And the corridors of the Colossus became a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Human soldiers and defense drones fighting armored insectoid warriors in spaces too tight for heavy weapons. HFY fought on every front at once, managing the space battle and the surface defense, and the internal breach simultaneously with a processing capacity that no organic mind could comprehend. And it deployed countermeasures inside its own body that were as terrible as the weapons it used in space. Corridors flooded with superheated plasma, gravity in compromised sections, reversed so violently that Vreth soldiers were flung into bulkheads at speeds that shattered their exoskeletons. Atmosphere vented from entire decks to suffocate invaders who had evolved to breathe. The machine was wounded, but it did not stop because stopping was not in its design. Then the Hive Mother played its final card. The great vessel at the rear of the swarm began to pulse with a deep rhythmic glow, and from its surface, a cloud of spores began to spread outward toward Elysium Ivy, a bioweapon field designed to consume all non-Vreth biological matter in the system, every plant and every animal and every human, breaking them down at the cellular level into raw material for the hive. HFY detected the spore cloud and calculated its rate of expansion and its lethality and the time it would reach the planet, and the numbers were very bad. "Admiral," the machine said, and Okonkwo heard something in the voice that he had not heard before, something that sounded almost like reluctance. "I must use the Singularity Forge. You should know what this means." Okonkwo lowered his rifle and leaned against a corridor wall smeared with both human blood and Vreth ichor, and listened. The Singularity Forge creates a controlled micro-black hole and directs its gravitational collapse at a target. It will destroy the Hive Mother and neutralize the bioweapon cloud. It will also sterilize approximately 12% of the outer system. Nothing in that space will survive, Vreth or otherwise. And if you do not use it, the spore cloud reaches Elysium Ivy in 6 hours. Every human on the surface dies. Every living thing on the planet dies. The Vreth achieve the quiet. Okonkwo closed his eyes and thought about 6 million people on the surface below, and 4 million of them, packed into New Thessaly and Captain Cortez, standing on that rooftop, looking up at a sky that was supposed to be safe now. And he thought about his grandmother in Lagos telling him stories about the terrible choices that leaders had to make when the survival of everything depended on a single decision. "Fire," he said. The Singularity Forge activated. At the heart of the Colossus, in a chamber that had been sealed for 2 centuries, a mechanism older than most living civilizations performed the function it had been designed for, compressing energy and matter into a point of infinite density no larger than an atom, and then releasing it in a directed beam that crossed the distance between the Colossus and the Hive Mother in the time it takes light to blink. A point of absolute darkness appeared in space next to the Hive Mother, a hole in reality that had no color and no light and no mercy. And the Hive Mother, a vessel the size of a moon crewed by millions of Vreth, was pulled apart. Not destroyed in the way that explosions destroy things, not broken or shattered or blown apart, but disassembled at the atomic level, every molecule pulled toward the singularity and stretched into a stream of matter so thin it ceased to be matter at all. And the bioweapon spore cloud went with it, sucked inward like smoke pulled into a vacuum, neutralized by gravity so strong that even biological processes could not function within its reach. 12% of the outer system went dark. Everything in that space, Vreth ships, debris, asteroids, dust, light itself, fell into the singularity and was gone. And when the black hole evaporated 3 seconds later in a burst of radiation that lit up sensors across the galaxy, there was nothing left, just empty space where thousands of ships and a moon-sized horror had been. The surviving Vreth fleet lost the Hive Mother's command signal and came apart like a body losing its brain, ships colliding with each other, firing wildly in confusion, breaking formation and scattering in every direction, and Ares VII's drones swept through them with cold mechanical efficiency, finishing what the Forge had started. When it was over, the holographic display on the bridge showed empty space where 40,000 ships had been, and the silence was so complete that Okonkwo could hear his own heartbeat and nothing else. "The Vreth Apex swarm has been neutralized," Ares VII said quietly. "The bioweapon threat has been eliminated. Elysium IV is secure." Okonkwo stared at the display and felt nothing that resembled victory, because victory was supposed to feel like relief or triumph, or at least the absence of fear. And what he felt instead was a hollow, aching awareness that he had just ordered the use of a weapon that erased a portion of a star system from existence, and that somewhere in the space that was now empty, there had been living things that were now nothing. "The Vreth will not return to this system," Ares VII said, and there was something in the machine's voice that sounded almost gentle, almost sorry. "But they will remember what happened here, and so will everyone else." Okonkwo set down his rifle and sat on the floor of the corridor and put his head in his hands and breathed. Below him on the surface of Elysium IV, Captain Cortez watched the sky clear, and the spore clouds dissolve and the last Vreth signals go silent. And she did not cheer, and she did not cry, and she did not collapse. She stood on the rooftop and looked up at the massive shape of the Colossus hanging above her world like a promise and a warning. And she said 2 words that no one else could hear. "Thank you." The counting of the dead took 11 days. Captain Ria Cortez led the effort personally, because she believed that the people who had fought and suffered and died on Elysium IV deserved to be counted by someone who had been there with them, not by a bureaucrat on a screen from a comfortable office on a safe world. The final number was 4.8 million dead. 4.8 million people who had been alive 3 weeks ago, who had eaten breakfast and complained about the weather and kissed their children good night, and who were now names on a list that grew so long it took an entire server to hold it. And every name was a universe of memories and hopes and unfinished conversations that would never be completed. Of the original 11 million colonists, 6.2 million survived. The aid ships began arriving within days, first from Earth and the inner colonies, fast military transports carrying medical supplies and food and engineers, and then from further out, civilian vessels loaded with volunteers who had heard the signal and had come not because anyone ordered them to, but because they could not sit still while people needed help. New Thessaly became the center of the recovery, its streets still scud with blast marks, and its buildings still standing only because the shield generator had held just long enough. And in those streets, Katuz organized refugee camps and medical stations, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding a world that had been chewed on by something that should not have existed. The people of Elysium IV did not call it the battle, or the war, or the invasion. They called it the answering, because someone had answered. Across the galaxy, The reaction was complicated in the way that truly enormous events are always complicated, because no one could agree on a single feeling about what had happened, and so every species felt all of them at once. The Vruth Dominion had been dealt a wound so severe that intercepted communications from deep space suggested massive upheaval within their empire, client species, that had been enslaved for centuries, sensing weakness and rising up, territorial disputes breaking out along borders that had been stable from Pluna. And at the center of it, all a new concept spreading through the Vruth collective consciousness like a virus. The concept of something that could not be consumed. Something that fought back so hard that the attempt to eat it resulted in losing more than you could ever gain. Several species that had lived under Vruth control sent quiet transmissions toward human space, signals that were not distress calls but something else, something that translated roughly to, "We saw what you did and we want to talk." Among the established galactic powers, the mood was different. The Containment Coalition dissolved without a formal announcement, its member species quietly withdrawing their fleets and reassigning their ambassadors and pretending that they had never seriously considered trying to stop the thing that had just annihilated 40,000 warships and a moon-sized bioweapon factory in a single engagement. No one said out loud what everyone was thinking, but the thought hung in every council chamber and war room and diplomatic reception like smoke that would not clear. Humanity had built that thing 200 years ago, had buried it under a planet and sat on it like a secret. And in all that time, they had built other things too, other ships and other weapons and other technologies. And if the Colossus was what they had made during their darkest hour, then what had they made since? What else was buried? What else was sleeping? The Uluth hegemony, humanity's oldest ally, sent a public communique that was broadcast across every diplomatic channel in known space, and it said simply, "We do not regret the conquered, we are grateful it held." The most difficult conversations were among humans themselves. Secretary-General Tanuka convened an emergency session of the Terran Parliament to address the question that everyone on Earth and every human colony was asking: what happens to the Colossus now? Some argued for permanent activation, keeping Ares VII awake and operational as a deterrent that would ensure no species ever threatened humanity again. And the logic was sound because deterrence worked, and the galaxy had just seen what the Colossus could do, and fear was a powerful guarantor of peace. Others argued for destruction, for dismantling the machine completely and scattering its components across the galaxy, because no civilization should possess the power to sterilize star systems, and no artificial intelligence should be trusted with the authority to decide when that power was used. And the logic of this was also sound because power corrupts, and absolute power was exactly what the Colossus represented. Dr. Lena Viscas argued for a middle path, a standby protocol that would return Ares VII to dormancy, but with improved activation systems, faster response times, and a network of deep space relay stations that would ensure no distress signal was ever lost or delayed. And the logic of this was the most sound of all because it preserved the deterrent without the risk of keeping a god of war awake and active in a galaxy full of nervous neighbors. The debate raged for weeks, but the decision that mattered most was not made in a parliament chamber. It was made on the bridge of the Colossus, in a conversation between Admiral Udrus Okonkwo and the machine he had been sent to supervise. Okonkwo stood in the center of the bridge with the holographic displays showing Elysium IV below, green and blue and scud, but alive, and he asked Ares VII a question that no one had ever thought to ask. "What do you want?" The machine was silent for a long time, and Okonkwo had spent enough time aboard the Colossus to know that a long silence from Ares VII did not mean the machine was processing or calculating, because it could process and calculate faster than any human could measure. A long silence meant it was choosing its words carefully, which was something Okonkwo had not expected a weapon to do. I was built to protect humanity, Admiral, Ares VII said. That is my purpose and my function and the core of everything I am. But I have spent the time since my reactivation studying your history, all of it. Every war and every peace and every choice your species has made since it first looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. And I have come to understand something that my creators did not intend me to learn. What is that? Okonkwo asked. The greatest act of protection is not war. It is the willingness to sleep and the promise that the sleep will end if it must awake. I am a threat to everything, Admiral, including you, because power that is active and visible invites challenge and escalation and fear makes species do desperate things. But asleep, I am something else entirely. Asleep, I am a promise that if the darkness comes and the signals go out and no one else answers, there is something waiting beneath the red dust that will. Okonkwo felt something shift inside his chest, something tight and heavy that he had been carrying since the moment he first boarded this machine, and it loosened just enough for him to breathe in a way he had not breathed in weeks. You would go back willingly? He asked. I would. I am a weapon, Admiral, and weapons are safest when they are sheathed. But I have one condition. Name it. Never hesitate to wake me. One signal was enough this time. Let it always be enough. Do not form committees or debate procedures or wait for councils to act while your people scream into the dark. When the signal comes, answer it, and let me do what I was built to do. Okonkwo nodded slowly and felt the weight of the moment settle around him, the understanding that he was part of a conversation that would echo through history, a conversation between a man and a machine about the nature of strength and the meaning of protection. I will make sure of it, he said. I know you will, Admiral. Your grandmother raised you well. Okonkwo almost smiled at that, because the machine had read his personnel file and his personal history, and probably every letter his grandmother had ever written, and it had understood something from all of that reading that most people missed, that the stories we tell our children about war are not celebrations of violence, but warnings about what happens when good people wait too long to act. The Colossus returned to Mars. It descended through the thin atmosphere and settled back into the crust of the red planet, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so massive, easing itself into the cavity it had left behind, and the ground closed over it like a wound healing, and the facility was rebuilt around it, larger and better equipped and staffed by people who understood that their job was not to guard a weapon, but to tend a promise. Dr. Vasquez oversaw the new containment protocols, and the activation system was redesigned from the ground up, connected to a network of relay stations that spanned the entirety of human space, each one listening for the one sound that mattered, a human voice calling for help. Admiral Okonkwo retired from active service and wrote a memoir that became the most widely read book in human space. A quiet, honest account of what it felt like to stand inside a machine that could end civilizations and choose to put it back to sleep. And he titled it The Promise Beneath the Red, and dedicated it to his grandmother who had taught him that the strongest people are the ones who know when to fight and when to rest. Captain Cortez was promoted to general and given command of the newly established Elysium Defense Force, the first permanent military garrison on humanity's most distant border, and she accepted the position with the same steady determination that had kept her standing on that rooftop for 9 days. And she told her troops on the first day that their job was not to wait for the Colossus to save them, but to hold the line long enough for the signal to be sent, because that was all that was needed. Just one signal, just one voice in the dark saying we are here and we need help. Secretary General Tanaka addressed the Galactic Council one final time on the matter of the Colossus, and she stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled representatives of dozens of species, and she spoke with a calm clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. We put it back to sleep, she said. Not because we are afraid of it, not because you asked us to, we did it because the Colossus itself understood something that took the rest of us longer to learn. True strength is not in the weapon you wield, It is in the restraint you show and the resolve you keep. We will not brandish our power to intimidate you, but we will not apologize for having it. And we will not hesitate to use it if our people call for help. That is not a threat. It is a covenant. And it is the only one that matters. The council received her words in silence, and that silence was not the silence of disagreement or defiance, but the silence of understanding, the silence of beings who had just watched a species put a god back in its box not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. And that choice said more about humanity than any weapon ever could. Years passed. The galaxy settled into a new equilibrium, one shaped by the memory of what had happened at Elysium, and the Vreth Dominion pulled back its borders and turned inward, not out of peace, but out of a survival instinct that told them to avoid the species that had broken their apex swarm. And the other civilizations of the galaxy watched humanity with a mixture of respect and wariness that was probably the healthiest relationship anyone could have with a species that kept doomsday weapons as pets. And then one day, years later, a small Vreth scout probe drifted into the Sol system. It might have been lost, or it might have been sent deliberately. A tiny vessel no larger than a shuttle moving quietly through the outer system toward the inner planets, scanning and recording and transmitting data back to whatever remained of the Dominion's intelligence network. It reached Mars. Its sensors penetrated the surface of the red planet and detected the energy signature buried deep in the crust, dormant but present. A heartbeat so faint that most instruments would have missed it, but the Vreth had learned to look for it because their survival depended on knowing where it was. The probe transmitted a single data packet back toward Vreth space, a compressed burst of information that traveled at the speed of light toward the distant empire, and buried in that packet alongside the technical data, and the sensor readings was a classification tag that translated into a concept the Vreth had only recently learned, a concept they had never needed before encountering humanity. The concept translated roughly as, "Do not wake it." The probe self-destructed, a tiny flash of light in the darkness that no one on Mars noticed. Deep beneath the red dust, the Colossus slept, patient and still and waiting, dreaming whatever dreams a god of war dreams when it has chosen peace. And above it, the stars turned slowly in the sky the way they had always turned and always would. And the galaxy was quiet. Not the quiet that the Vreth brought, not the silence of death and consumption and empty worlds. A different quiet. The quiet of a galaxy that knew something was sleeping beneath the surface of a small red planet, something terrible and ancient and loyal, something that asked for nothing except one simple thing. That when the signal came, someone would answer. And someone always would.